Scary Deep Woods Stories. Secrets Beneath the Floorboards, a horror story. When I first saw the house, it was nothing special at first glance. Just another old, slightly run-down Victorian-style home nestled in the heart of an American city that had seen better days. The peeling paint, the creaking wooden porch, the overgrown garden, it all gave the impression of neglect. But beneath that, I sensed something else. A lingering presence, something ancient and heavy that seemed to cling to the walls and settle in the shadows. I ignored the nagging feeling, attributing it to the stress of moving, the weight of starting fresh in a new place. The neighborhood was quiet enough, with occasional bursts of city noise in the distance, the kind that made you feel like you were alone, but not quite disconnected. The real estate agent assured me it was a gem of a property, full of history and character, but said nothing about the past buried beneath. As I signed the papers and took the keys, the air around me seemed to grow colder, the sunlight dimmer. That night, sleep escaped me entirely. The house was alive with strange sounds, the soft creaks and groans of settling wood, but also whispers, faint and unintelligible, that seemed to drift through the halls like ghostly breaths. In my dreams, I was pulled deep underground, into a dark pit where countless faces stared up at me, hollow-eyed and pleading. I awoke in a sweat, heart pounding, to the sound of something scratching at the walls. I told myself it was just the house adjusting, or my imagination playing tricks. Days passed, and the disturbances grew worse. Lights flickered with no explanation. Cold spots moved through rooms, and at night footsteps echoed above me when I was sure I was alone. The neighbors avoided eye contact when I asked about the house's history, their smiles forced and eyes darting away. One elderly man finally spoke, voice low and trembling, warning me about the ground beneath my feet. He told me stories of a forgotten cemetery, bulldozed decades ago to make way for new developments, of mass graves hastily covered and sealed by desperate hands. They say the restless ones still walk there, he said, those buried without names, without peace. Panic gripped me, but curiosity won out. I began researching the property's past, poring over old city records and newspaper clippings, uncovering layers of history stained with tragedy and silence. The more I learned, the heavier the atmosphere became. The house was built directly on a mass grave, a final resting place for the victims of a horrific event long erased from memory. At night, the shadows grew longer, deeper, as if reaching out to me. I began seeing her, the woman from my nightmares, her fiery red hair tangled, her eyes filled with sorrow and warning. She appeared at the edge of my vision, vanishing when I looked directly, always beckoning me to uncover the truth. The house, the grave, the restless souls. They were all connected, and I was the key. My sanctuary had become a prison, and every day that passed brought me closer to the dark heart of the secret buried beneath my home. The days after that first harrowing night blurred together like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. I found myself unable to escape the oppressive feeling that the house was watching me, that every shadow hid something waiting to emerge. Sleep was fleeting and fragmented, and my waking hours were consumed by the task of uncovering more about the dark past beneath my feet. I spent hours at the city archives, poring over yellowed newspapers, land records, and police reports, desperately piecing together fragments of a forgotten tragedy. What I uncovered was worse than I had imagined, a fire that had swept through a poorly regulated orphanage in the early 1900s, a building that once stood where my house now did, a place where dozens of children had perished trapped inside. The fire had been ruled accidental, a tragic consequence of careless maintenance, but local whispers told a different story. Rumors of a cult performing rituals in the basement, sacrifices meant to bind evil spirits to the land. The city, eager to move on, had covered up the darker truths, bulldozing the remains without ceremony and burying the victims in a mass grave hurriedly dug beneath the earth. That grave had never been properly marked, never given a resting place in the light of day. My house had been built right on top of it, the foundation pressing down on the bones and the grief that never left them. Returning home felt like descending deeper into a well of despair. Each room seemed to pulse with a strange energy, cold and heavy, pressing against my skin. At night, the whispers returned, louder now, voices overlapping in a mournful chorus that chilled me to the bone. Sometimes I could swear I saw fleeting figures just beyond the corners of my vision. Children's faces pressed against windows, hands reaching through walls, desperate to be seen. The red-haired woman appeared more frequently, no longer a shadow but a figure of desperate urgency. She no longer spoke, but her eyes screamed warnings, imploring me to stop digging into the past before it was too late. One night the temperature dropped suddenly, the lights flickering as if the house itself was shivering. I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the stairs, slow and deliberate, though I was alone. I followed the sound, heart hammering, and found the old basement door creaking open, revealing darkness so thick it swallowed the light. I hesitated, but some part of me was drawn down, compelled by an invisible force. Taking a flashlight, I descended the narrow steps into the basement, the air thick with dust and a rotten smell that made me gag. There I found a series of cryptic symbols etched into the walls, their shapes twisted and ancient, covered in a thick layer of grime. I recognized some from the journal I'd found earlier, but others were unfamiliar, pulsing faintly with a sickly glow. As I shone my light around, the beam caught on a pile of broken wood and shattered glass, remnants of furniture long destroyed, and then on something that made my blood run cold. Small bones, arranged in a rough circle like a morbid altar. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into near-total darkness. My flashlight flickered violently, and in the shadows I saw shapes moving, indistinct but unmistakably human. The air filled with a cacophony of voices, cries of pain, whispers of anger, pleas for mercy. I pressed my back against the cold wall, struggling to breathe, the sensation of unseen hands brushing my skin, cold and clammy. Then a figure emerged, a woman, her hair wild and red, eyes glowing with a terrible light. She reached out to me, voice barely more than a whisper. "You should not have come here." I barely had time to react before the house itself seemed to shudder violently, the ground beneath me trembling as if the earth was awakening. Something ancient, something angry, was stirring beneath the floorboards. I clawed at the door, desperate to escape, and when I finally burst into the hallway, I slammed the door shut behind me and pressed my ear against it. Hearing the growls and howls of a fury I could not begin to comprehend. That night I realized the house was no longer just haunted. It was alive with a malevolent presence, feeding on the past's pain and rage, and it had marked me as its next prisoner. The morning after that terrifying night, I barely recognized myself. Exhausted, trembling, and haunted by what I had experienced in the basement, I was caught between disbelief and dread. How could a place I once thought was merely old and creaky become a nexus of darkness that threatened to consume me? I decided I had to understand what I was dealing with before it was too late. I scoured through more archives, desperate for answers, and discovered something that twisted the knife deeper. The fire had not just been an accident or even a secret ritual. It had been a massacre orchestrated by people who wanted to erase the orphanage and its children from existence. The city officials had conspired with a powerful religious sect that deemed the children cursed, a blight that must be wiped away to cleanse the land. Their actions were brutal, their silence absolute. Witnesses had disappeared, records were altered, and the mass grave was a testament to the lengths they had gone to cover up their crimes. Every night after, the house's oppressive atmosphere worsened. Shadows grew darker, noises sharper, and those chilling whispers turned into anguished cries that seeped into my bones. One night I saw footsteps in the dust, small and frantic, appearing on the floorboards where no one had walked. Doors slammed without wind, windows rattled violently, and the scent of smoke and something far fouler lingered in the air. The red-haired woman returned often, sometimes leading me to objects hidden in the house. Old photographs, a cracked locket, a tattered doll, each revealing a piece of the children's stories. I realized they were trying to communicate through me, to tell the truth that had been buried with them. But the more I uncovered, the more dangerous it became. Shadows began to coalesce into figures that stalked me in the house, their hollow eyes filled with pain and rage. I found scratches on my walls, deep and raw, as if someone or something was trapped behind them, trying desperately to break free. One evening, as I sat in the living room, the lights went out completely, plunging me into darkness. My phone died instantly. The air grew thick, suffocating, and I heard breathing, slow, deliberate, and chilling. A voice whispered my name, soft but filled with menace. I tried to stand, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The temperature dropped until frost formed on the window panes. Then I saw her again, the red-haired woman, standing silently in the corner, eyes blazing. She reached out, and suddenly I was flooded with memories that were not mine. Children screaming in the fire, desperate hands clawing at the walls, faces twisted in terror and betrayal. I stumbled back, gasping, and when I hit the floor, the room filled with dozens of ghostly children, their faces pale and eyes wide, surrounding me. They spoke in unison, their voices a heart-wrenching chorus, begging for justice and release. I knew then that this house was a prison, not just for the dead, but for their memories and pain. They needed me to uncover the truth so they could finally rest. But darker forces were at work. That night, a shadow moved behind me, far more solid and threatening than the others. It whispered promises of silence and oblivion, warning me to stop digging or suffer consequences worse than death. The boundary between the living and the dead was breaking down, and I was caught in the middle. Desperation drove me to seek help, but no one believed my story. Friends and neighbors dismissed my fears as stress-induced paranoia, and the local historians refused to talk about the mass grave, their faces pale and voices trembling. I was alone, trapped in a house that was both my home and a tomb, haunted by memories that refused to die and entities that grew more hostile by the day. Sleep became impossible. I began sleeping with the lights on, windows locked tight, and a knife by my side. But even then, I wasn't safe. The shadows crept closer, their wails louder, their presence heavier. The red-haired woman's appearances became more frantic, her warnings more urgent. But I couldn't understand what she wanted from me beyond the truth. Then one night, I found a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of the bedroom. Inside was a leather-bound journal, brittle with age but surprisingly intact. It belonged to a caretaker of the orphanage, a man who had tried to save the children and expose the conspiracy, but had vanished without a trace. His words detailed horrors beyond imagination, rituals performed to bind the children's spirits, betrayals by those sworn to protect them, and a curse laid upon the land and anyone who dared to disturb it. Reading the journal filled me with dread and resolve. I had to finish what he started, to bring peace to the restless souls trapped beneath my house. But I feared the house itself was turning against me, and the darkness was no longer content to remain hidden in the shadows. It was coming for me. The discovery of the caretaker's journal shook me to my core, but it also gave me a grim clarity. The horrors beneath my feet were not random hauntings or residual energy. They were the result of deliberate, malevolent actions meant to trap the souls of the innocent and silence the truth forever. As I pored over the brittle pages, the caretaker's voice echoed in my mind, a desperate plea for justice and release. His entries spoke of nights filled with terror, of shadowy figures performing twisted rituals in the orphanage basement, of children crying out in pain and fear as their spirits were forcibly bound to the land. He wrote of his own attempts to intervene, secretly bearing tokens of protection beneath the building's foundation, hoping to contain the evil long enough for someone to come after him and finish the job. But his final entries were filled with despair. The realization that the darkness was too powerful, that the conspirators were determined to keep the truth buried along with the children's bodies. His last words were a warning. If you find this, you are next. The house will not let you go. That night I lay awake, clutching the journal, haunted by the weight of his final message. I understood then that this was no longer just about my home or my safety. The evil buried here was ancient and hungry, and I was now entwined in a battle I could neither understand fully nor escape. The house seemed to breathe around me, the walls pulsing with a sickly glow that flickered through the darkness. The whispers returned, this time louder, more insistent, a cacophony of voices pleading, warning, begging for release. I felt their pain, their anger, their desperation. They were trapped between worlds, caught in a limbo of torment created by cruelty and betrayal. The next day, I searched the house meticulously, looking for any signs of the protective tokens the caretaker mentioned. In the attic, beneath rotting floorboards, I found a small wooden box sealed with rusted nails. Inside were strange charms, pieces of iron shaped like crosses, shards of glass etched with symbols, and dried herbs long since faded to dust. I felt a strange mixture of hope and fear as I gathered these relics. If they had worked once, perhaps they could still help. But the house did not welcome my actions. That night the shadows grew restless, coalescing into forms that circled me like predators stalking prey. I heard footsteps echoing from the basement, slow and deliberate. Though I had locked the door tight, the red-haired woman appeared again, her eyes pleading. But this time there was something else. A new figure emerged beside her, darker, more menacing. I could not see its face, only the outline of a man cloaked in shadows, his presence suffocating and cold. The woman whispered urgently, "He guards the secret. He cannot be stopped." Panic surged through me. The house was alive with forces beyond my comprehension, and I was caught in the middle of a war between restless souls and something far worse. Determined to confront this darkness, I resolved to return to the basement, despite the terror it filled me with. Armed with the caretaker's journal and the protective charms, I descended the stairs once more. The air was thick with a choking mist that clung to my skin, and the walls seemed to close in around me. I could hear the distant sound of children laughing, a haunting melody that twisted into screams as I moved deeper into the darkness. At the center of the basement, I found a large stone slab, etched with the same cryptic symbols I had seen before. The caretaker's journal mentioned this altar, a focal point for the rituals that bound the spirits. As I prepared to place the charms on the slab, the shadowy figure appeared, blocking my path. His voice was a low growl, echoing through the chamber. "Leave now, or join them forever." Fear gripped me, but I stood my ground. Placing the charms one by one on the altar, I began to recite the protective incantations from the journal. The room trembled violently, dust and debris falling from the ceiling, and the shadows screamed in fury. The red-haired woman appeared beside me, her face alight with hope and pain, chanting alongside me. The altar glowed with an eerie light, and a great force seemed to lift from the earth. Suddenly, the door behind me burst open, and I was thrown backward by a wave of energy. As I hit the floor, the shadowy figure vanished, replaced by a silence so deep it was deafening. For a moment, I believed the nightmare was over. But then, a cold whisper brushed against my ear. "This is only the beginning." I looked up to see the red-haired woman fading into the shadows, her expression one of sorrow and warning. I knew the battle was far from finished, and that the house still held many secrets, secrets that, if uncovered, could destroy me. The aftermath of my confrontation in the basement left me shaken but oddly hopeful. The protective charms, the ritual from the caretaker's journal, had disrupted the oppressive force lurking beneath the house, if only for a moment. But deep down, I knew this was far from over. The shadows had retreated, but not vanished. The house still breathed with an ancient evil, and every creak and groan reminded me that the spirits trapped below were restless, their anguish far from soothed. The next morning, I decided to leave the house for a while. I needed fresh air, a break from the suffocating atmosphere that seemed to cling to my skin like a second layer. As I stepped outside, the neighborhood looked deceptively normal. Kids playing on the sidewalks, neighbors chatting, birds singing. But beneath this veneer of suburban peace lurked the unseen horrors of my home. I walked aimlessly, my mind racing with the caretaker's journal and the cryptic warnings it contained. I needed answers beyond what I could find in old pages. I headed to the city library, hoping to find newspaper archives or public records that might shed more light on the orphanage's tragic past and the mass grave. The building was imposing, filled with dusty shelves and dim lighting, and the smell of old paper seemed to permeate the air. I spent hours combing through microfilms, old photographs, and legal documents, piecing together a timeline of events. The orphanage had been founded in the early 1900s, a refuge for abandoned children, but it quickly fell under the control of a religious group whose influence extended deeply into the city's government. Corruption ran rampant, and the children were subjected to harsh discipline and cruel treatment, with rumors of abuse whispered in hushed tones. Then one night the fire broke out. Official reports claimed it was accidental, but eyewitness accounts, scarce and heavily suppressed, told a different story. The fire was deliberate, a cover-up to erase the children and the sins of those in power. The city had built over the site to hide the crime, and the mass grave beneath my house was their secret, buried and forgotten. As I delved deeper, I noticed a pattern: disappearances and unexplained deaths among those who had tried to expose the truth. Whistleblowers had been silenced, either through intimidation or worse. It became clear that the darkness haunting my home was a physical manifestation of the city's buried guilt and unresolved evil. I returned home with a growing sense of urgency and dread. That night, as I lay in bed, the temperature dropped sharply, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch toward me. The red-haired woman appeared again, her face a mask of sorrow and determination. She gestured urgently toward the basement door, then vanished. Summoning every ounce of courage, I descended once more, the protective charms clutched tightly in my hand. The air was thick and heavy, the silence broken only by the faint sound of dripping water. As I reached the altar, I found new markings etched into the stone, symbols I hadn't seen before, pulsating faintly with a sinister glow. I realized the evil was evolving, adapting to my attempts to contain it. Suddenly, the shadowy figure returned, more solid and terrifying than ever. His voice was a whisper that echoed in my mind, promising eternal torment if I persisted. I raised the charms, reciting the incantations from the journal with trembling voice. The room shook violently, dust swirling in the air, and the shadows screamed in rage. But amidst the chaos, a new presence made itself known, a child's voice, clear and desperate, cutting through the darkness. "Help us," it pleaded. The red-haired woman appeared beside me, her eyes shining with hope. She revealed herself as the spirit of a former caretaker, bound to the house by her failure to protect the children. She begged me to find the hidden entrance to the mass grave beneath the house and bring the truth to light, to free the children's souls trapped in eternal darkness. Fueled by a mixture of fear and determination, I began searching the basement walls for clues. Hours passed as I traced the symbols, tapped on bricks, and moved furniture aside. Finally, behind a loose stone, I found a hidden passage leading into darkness. The air was colder than ever, and the scent of earth and decay filled my nostrils. I lit a flashlight and stepped inside, the narrow tunnel descending steeply into the earth. As I moved deeper, I could hear faint voices, whispers of children calling out, echoes of their pain and fear. The walls were lined with old bones and remnants of clothing, confirming the horrifying truth. This was the mass grave, the final resting place of the orphanage's lost souls. I felt a crushing weight of sorrow and anger, the realization of the evil buried beneath my home, threatening to break me. But I also felt a spark of hope, the chance to finally expose the truth and bring peace to the restless spirits. Suddenly, the shadowy figure appeared at the tunnel's entrance, blocking my way back. His form was immense, eyes glowing with hatred. The battle between light and darkness had reached its climax. I clutched the caretaker's journal and the protective charms, preparing to face whatever came next. The house was no longer just a home. It was a battleground for lost souls, a place where the past refused to die, and where I would either become its next victim or its savior. The shadow blocking the entrance to the tunnel was no longer just a fleeting apparition. It had solidified into something monstrous, a dark silhouette with glowing eyes that pierced the murky depths of the underground passage. My heart pounded relentlessly in my chest, echoing in the suffocating silence as I stood frozen, clutching the journal and the protective charms tighter than ever. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, but I knew escaping now would mean leaving the trapped souls to suffer forever, condemned beneath my very feet. The air thickened, swirling with a heavy, oppressive energy that made each breath feel like shards of glass scraping down my throat. The darkness twisted and writhed as if alive, pulsating with malevolence. Then unexpectedly, the red-haired woman's spirit reappeared beside me, her ethereal glow illuminating the tunnel walls faintly, casting wavering shadows that danced like desperate pleas. "You cannot turn back now," she whispered urgently. "This spirit is the guardian of their pain, the keeper of the darkness. You must face him if you want to free the children." I swallowed my fear and stepped forward, the flashlight beam trembling in my grasp. The shadow loomed larger, its form shifting like smoke, tendrils of darkness reaching out hungrily. I repeated the protective incantations under my breath, the words from the journal weaving a fragile shield of light around me. The shadow let out a low, guttural growl, the sound reverberating through the tunnel and shaking loose dust from the ceiling. Then it surged forward, faster than I could react, its inky tendrils sweeping towards me like deadly whips. Instinctively, I raised the charms, and a burst of blinding light exploded from my hands, momentarily pushing back the darkness. The shadow hissed in pain but did not retreat. I realized this was a battle of wills, a war between light and dark that had been raging beneath the city for decades. My mind raced through the caretaker's journal for clues, desperate for anything that might tip the balance. One passage caught my eye, an ancient prayer meant to call forth the souls trapped in torment and bind their pain to release. Gathering my courage, I chanted the prayer aloud, my voice echoing against the damp stone. As the final words left my lips, a chorus of faint whispers filled the air, children's voices, sorrowful yet hopeful. Slowly, flickering lights appeared along the tunnel walls, ghostly apparitions of the children who had perished in the orphanage fire, their faces etched with sorrow and innocence lost. They surrounded me, their presence both comforting and heartbreaking. The shadow recoiled, its power weakened by the collective spirit of those it had imprisoned. But it fought back fiercely, launching shadowy spikes that scraped the tunnel walls and forced me to dodge frantically. The battle stretched on, my energy draining, but I felt a growing connection to the children, their pain fueling my resolve. The red-haired woman's spirit guided me, pointing toward a cluster of bones piled in the far corner of the tunnel. "This is their anchor," she said. "Destroy it, and you break the curse." Steeling myself, I moved toward the pile, but as I reached out to disturb it, the shadow lunged, knocking me to the cold stone floor. Pain exploded in my side, but I gritted my teeth and fought back, using the charms to strike at the darkness. With a final surge of strength, I grasped the pile of bones and shattered them against the tunnel wall. A deafening silence followed, broken only by the sound of the spirit's collective sighs of release. The tunnel trembled, dust falling like rain as the oppressive darkness began to dissipate, replaced by a gentle warmth that felt like the first light after a long night. The ghostly children smiled, their forms becoming more translucent, then slowly ascending toward a distant glow. The promise of peace and freedom at last. The red-haired woman looked at me with gratitude, her form beginning to fade. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have broken the curse." As the last spirit disappeared, the tunnel's exit opened fully, sunlight streaming in and banishing the shadows. Exhausted but victorious, I climbed back into the basement. The heavy atmosphere lifted, the house feeling lighter, almost alive with renewed hope. But as I looked around, I realized the city above still hid many secrets, and my journey had only just begun. The past had been unearthed, but the consequences of revealing it would ripple far beyond the walls of my home. Outside, the neighborhood seemed unchanged, still vibrant, still full of life. But beneath it all, the scars of history remained buried, waiting for the day they might rise again. For now, though, I had given the children their voice, and in doing so, reclaimed a piece of my own soul from the darkness. Days passed since the night I shattered the pile of bones deep in the basement tunnel, but the weight of what I'd uncovered and the battle I'd fought still clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. The house, once oppressive and dark, now held an eerie calm, but something inside me whispered that the peace was fragile, temporary. That night, as I lay in bed, the silence of the house was pierced by a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on glass. It wasn't just the old pipes or settling wood. It was deliberate. I followed the sound down the hallway to the basement door. My hand hesitated on the cold knob, The darkness beyond beckoned with secrets still unspoken. Pulling the door open, I was hit with a cold wave of air, heavier than before, and that same familiar scent, damp earth and something metallic, like blood. I switched on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom, and saw the walls seem to breathe, shadows shifting unnaturally, pulsing as if alive. The shattered bones from the pile I had broken lay scattered, yet some seemed to twitch, as if trying to reassemble themselves. Then a whisper, low and broken, curled around my ears, words barely audible but laced with warning. You should not have come back. The voice was neither male nor female, but something older, more ancient. I stepped deeper into the tunnel, clutching the charms tighter, feeling the air thicken with dread. My eyes caught something new, faint scratch marks along the walls, as if someone or something had clawed at the stone with desperate fury. The red-haired woman's spirit appeared again, pale and ethereal, her expression grave. The darkness has not left, only retreated. It grows stronger, feeding off your fear. I swallowed hard, nerves fraying at the edges. How do I stop it? How do I keep it from coming back? She reached out, her translucent fingers brushing my cheek, leaving a cold trail. There is one last thing buried beneath this house, a source, a root of the curse. It must be found and destroyed, but it will not be easy. The spirit you battled was but a guardian, a sentinel. The true darkness lies deeper, where no light has ever touched. I nodded, steeling myself for what lay ahead. The walls around me began to tremble as I moved forward, the tunnel twisting into a labyrinthine maze of corridors. Some crumbled and blocked, others opening into vast chambers, dripping with water and decay. Every step echoed with the distant sounds of crying children, but their voices were mixed now with something far more sinister. A deep growl, low and resonant, vibrating through the stone. I realized the house was alive, feeding on the memories, the pain, the fear of all who had suffered here. Then as I rounded a bend, I stumbled upon a chamber unlike any other. The floor was carpeted with thick, black roots that pulsed as if breathing. In the center lay an altar carved from stone, covered in strange symbols and dried blood. Hanging from the ceiling were remnants of old chains, rusted and broken, hinting at torture and imprisonment. The air was suffocating, heavy with the weight of centuries of pain and suffering. I reached out to touch the altar, and as my fingers brushed the cold stone, visions flooded my mind. Children bound and screaming, shadowy figures chanting in a language I couldn't understand, and a dark ritual meant to imprison souls beneath the earth forever. A surge of power knocked me back, and I hit the wall hard, pain flaring across my back. The darkness was reacting, trying to protect its secret. The red-haired woman appeared again, her voice trembling with urgency. You must destroy the altar. It's the heart of the curse, the anchor for the mass grave's torment. Only then can the souls be freed completely. I pulled from my bag a small vial of salt and sprinkled it over the altar, then began chanting the protective prayers from the journal. The roots writhed violently, trying to ensnare me, but the light from the charms pushed back against the creeping blackness. As the prayer reached its climax, the altar cracked, shards flying like glass. The roots withered, shriveling and blackening until they crumbled to dust. A roar echoed through the tunnels, an ancient, furious cry of defeat. The house shook violently, walls cracking, and the ground trembling beneath me. I stumbled out of the chamber, racing toward the basement exit as debris fell all around. Bursting into the daylight, I gasped for air, heart racing as the oppressive atmosphere lifted for good, or so I hoped. That night the city seemed quieter, as if holding its breath, the shadows retreating into forgotten corners. But deep inside, I knew the story wasn't over. Something had awakened in the darkness beneath my house, something ancient and relentless. And if I wanted to protect the innocent, I'd have to face it head on. The next morning, as I pored over the caretaker's journal once more, I found a hidden note scrawled hastily on the last page. Beware the shadows that wear a human face. Not all who wander are lost. Some seek to bind you in their darkness forever. I looked up, sensing a presence behind me. The room was empty, yet a cold chill crept along my spine. Outside, the city carried on, oblivious to the battle raging beneath its feet. But I was no longer just a homeowner. I was the keeper of a terrible secret, caught in a web of darkness stretching back generations. The war had just begun. The weight of the caretaker's final warning settled over me like a suffocating fog as I stared out my living room window into the indifferent city beyond. Beware the shadows that wear a human face. Those words echoed in my mind relentlessly, refusing to be silenced. For days after destroying the altar, the house felt quieter but not safe. Something had shifted beneath the surface, a presence lurking just beyond my perception, watching, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness I had disturbed was now searching for a new way in, a new vessel to claim. I began to notice subtle changes, small things at first, lights flickering in empty rooms, doors creaking open on their own, the smell of damp earth in the air even when the basement door was shut tight. At night, the shadows took on shapes that didn't belong, twisting into figures that vanished when I blinked. Then came the dreams. They started as fragmented images, a child's face, pale and terrified, hands reaching out from the earth, voices whispering my name from beneath the floorboards. But soon the dreams grew vivid and relentless, dragging me back to the massacre that had birthed the curse. I found myself standing in a mass grave, surrounded by the bodies of men, women, and children, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes pleading for release. A figure cloaked in darkness approached, an entity neither living nor dead, its face a shifting mask of torment and rage. "You freed the souls trapped above, but I remain," it hissed, voice like grinding stone. "I am the shadow of their pain, the stain on this city's soul, and now I will consume you." I awoke with a start, heart pounding, sweat cold on my skin. The air in my room was thick, almost tangible, as if the entity from my dream had crossed the veil. Determined to fight back, I dove deeper into the caretaker's journal and old city records, desperate to uncover more about the entity. I learned that the mass grave was the result of a series of atrocities during the city's dark past. Decades of racial violence, corrupt law enforcement cover-ups, and unmarked burials hidden beneath neighborhoods like mine. The entity, a twisted remnant of collective suffering and injustice, had fed on generations of pain, growing stronger with every act of cruelty. It was no mere ghost, but a force fueled by hatred and despair, able to manipulate the living by wearing their faces, twisting their identities, and bending reality. One chilling account described a family who had vanished after moving into a nearby house. Neighbors reported seeing their faces change, smiles turning to grimaces, eyes bleeding black tears before they disappeared without a trace. My blood ran cold. The entity could be anyone, anywhere, even someone I trusted. That night, I decided to set up cameras throughout the house, hoping to catch a glimpse of the entity's true form or its chosen disguise. The footage was disturbing. Shadows darted across rooms, objects moved inexplicably, and once the camera caught a fleeting image of a man standing in the hallway, face featureless, like a blank canvas. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of light, but my gut screamed otherwise. The house was alive and it was hunting me. In a desperate attempt to protect myself, I reached out to a local historian and spiritual medium I'd found through online forums. Lena. She was skeptical at first, but agreed to help after hearing my story. When she arrived, her eyes widened as she stepped into the house. "This place is a nexus of pain and evil," she said gravely. "The entity you're dealing with isn't just a spirit. It's a manifestation of a collective curse, born from blood and betrayal. It needs a host, someone to anchor its power in the physical world." We spent hours performing rituals, burning sage and drawing protective symbols on the walls, but the entity retaliated viciously. Windows shattered, lights exploded, and a cold wind howled through the house, carrying with it the voices of the damned. Lena warned me that the entity was growing desperate and more dangerous. It would try to manipulate my mind, turning friends against me, whispering lies to erode my sanity. I felt its presence even when I was outside, lurking in alleyways and shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. One evening, while reviewing the security footage, I noticed a chilling pattern. The entity seemed to mimic the faces of people I'd met. The red-haired woman, Lena, even my closest friend, Mark. It was learning, adapting, weaving itself deeper into my life. I confronted Mark, but his expression flickered unnaturally before returning to normal. "You don't believe me," he said quietly, "but I want to help." Could I trust him? Or was the entity using his face to get closer? My paranoia grew, isolating me further. I became a prisoner in my own home, afraid to sleep, afraid to leave, haunted by the ever-watchful eyes of the darkness. Then one night, a new voice broke through the cacophony of whispers, a child's voice, clear and pleading. "Find the locket. It's the key." The red-haired woman's spirit appeared again, more solid than ever. She handed me a small rusted locket engraved with strange symbols. "This belonged to one of the children buried beneath us. It holds a piece of the entity's power. Destroy it, and you weaken the curse." But as I reached out to open the locket, the entity materialized behind me. An immense shadow with shifting faces, its roar shaking the very foundation of the house. The battle between light and dark was far from over, and this time the stakes were higher than ever. I gripped the locket tightly, knowing that my fight was not just for my soul, but for the city's salvation. The weight of the shadow pressed against my back as I clutched the ancient locket, its cold metal biting into my palm. I could feel the entity's breath, heavy and rancid, swirling around me like a storm of darkness, threatening to suffocate every ounce of hope. My hands trembled, but I forced myself to move, to face the nightmare looming over me. The house itself seemed to shudder under the entity's rage, walls groaning as if alive, floors creaking beneath unseen footsteps, pacing in the shadows. I stepped into the dim hallway, the flickering lights casting distorted silhouettes that danced like specters on cracked paint and peeling wallpaper. My mind raced, trying to piece together everything Lena had told me, every fragment of history buried beneath my feet and inside this cursed structure. The locket was the key, but how could a simple trinket hold the power to undo decades, no, centuries of suffering, violence, and death? I realized then that the locket wasn't just a key, it was a symbol of innocence lost and a vessel of memories too painful to let go. It held the essence of a child, one of the countless victims who had never found peace, whose souls had been consumed and twisted by the darkness. And the entity, that terrible force, was desperate to reclaim it, to prevent the truth from surfacing and shattering its grip on this world. With that thought came a renewed determination. I would not let this evil consume me or anyone else. But even as I made that silent vow, the house betrayed me. The air thickened, turning into a suffocating miasma that clawed at my lungs and clouded my vision. The floor beneath me cracked, splitting open like a jagged wound, revealing a pit of writhing shadows that seemed to reach for me with hungry fingers. From the depths emerged distorted faces, mouths agape in eternal screams, eyes pleading for release or revenge. I could no longer tell. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stand firm, raising the locket like a shield. Then, the air erupted with a deafening roar, a sound that felt like the cries of 1,000 lost souls. The entity manifested fully, a towering mass of black smoke and twisting faces, each one a reflection of torment and rage. Its voice was a terrible symphony of agony. 1,000 whispers and screams blended into one. "You cannot undo what was done. This city is mine, and I will drown it in despair." I gritted my teeth and stepped forward, clutching the locket closer to my chest. Suddenly it began to glow, a faint, eerie light emanating from its core, illuminating the darkness like a beacon of fragile hope. The faces in the shadows recoiled, some writhing in agony, others fading as if the light was unraveling their torment. I realized then that the locket was a tether, a connection to the humanity trapped beneath the city, and I had the power to sever it. Gathering every ounce of courage, I whispered an old prayer I had found in Lena's journal, an invocation meant to release trapped souls. As the words left my lips, the light from the locket grew brighter, casting long shadows that twisted and shrieked in retreat. The entity howled in fury, its form destabilizing, fracturing into tendrils of smoke and despair. But just as I thought I had the upper hand, the entity struck back. An invisible force slammed into me, sending me crashing against the wall. Pain exploded across my ribs, breath escaping in a harsh gasp. I struggled to stay conscious as the darkness closed in, tendrils wrapping around my limbs, squeezing the life from me. In the corner of my eye, I saw the red-haired woman's spirit appear once more, her eyes blazing with fierce determination. She reached out, touching the locket with a spectral hand, lending her strength to mine. The combined power of the locket and her spirit pushed back the tendrils, loosening the entity's grip. Summoning the last of my strength, I forced the locket open. Inside was a faded photograph of a smiling child, her eyes full of innocence and joy, so different from the tortured souls I had seen before. The moment the locket opened, a wave of warmth washed over me, and the house itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The shadows dissipated, the oppressive weight lifting, and the entity's roar faded into a low, mournful wail that echoed through the walls before vanishing altogether. I collapsed to the floor, exhaustion overtaking me, but a sense of peace settled in my chest for the first time since this nightmare began. The battle was far from over. There were still many victims trapped beneath the city, and I could feel faint traces of darkness lingering in the corners. But I had taken a crucial step toward breaking the curse. Over the following days, I noticed subtle changes in the house. The air was lighter, the oppressive silence replaced with faint echoes of laughter and whispered thanks. Neighbors who had long avoided the street began to return, their faces less wary, their eyes less haunted. Yet despite the progress, I remained vigilant. I knew the entity was not gone. It had been weakened but not destroyed. It was only a matter of time before it tried again, searching for new ways to seep into the lives of the unsuspecting. I contacted Lena to share what had happened and to prepare for what lay ahead. Together, we began researching other locations connected to the mass grave, determined to uncover the full extent of the curse and find a way to end it once and for all. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next chapter of this dark tale to unfold. But I was no longer alone, and I was no longer afraid. The locket, once a symbol of pain and loss, had become my weapon and my hope. And as the sun rose over the horizon, casting light over the city built on bones, I vowed to protect it no matter the cost. The days that followed the confrontation in my house felt like walking through a waking nightmare, painted with fragile streaks of hope. Despite the faint peace that the locket had brought, I knew the darkness beneath the city had not been vanquished, only pushed back. There was a weight pressing in on me, a quiet dread that whispered with every creak of the floorboards and every shadow cast by the fading daylight. The city itself seemed to pulse with secrets, its streets and alleyways hiding more than just forgotten history. I spent hours with Lena, poring over old maps, newspaper archives, and legal documents, trying to trace the original boundaries of the mass grave that lay beneath my house and the surrounding neighborhood. Each discovery deepened the mystery and intensified the urgency. The grave was not just a resting place for victims of a forgotten tragedy, it was a scar etched into the city's very foundation, a wound so raw that the pain had seeped into the present. What horrified me most was the evidence that the grave might be much larger than we initially thought, stretching under blocks and blocks of the city. Some places had been redeveloped, the ground turned and built over without anyone knowing what lay beneath. The implications were terrifying. What if others were living, working, and walking on top of such places, unknowingly disturbing the restless spirits? And worse, what if the entity, the dark force I had faced, had spread its influence beyond my house, lurking in the shadows of the entire city? That night I returned home alone, determined to face whatever was left in the dark. The locket hung heavy around my neck, a constant reminder of both the danger and the hope I carried. The house greeted me with silence, but it was a deceptive calm, like the stillness before a storm. As I stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply, frost blooming on the windows like spectral fingers reaching to grasp me. The walls whispered with distant voices, murmurs of sorrow, anger, and despair threading through the cold air. I moved cautiously through the rooms, senses heightened, heart pounding. The living room was darker than usual, shadows pooling in corners and shifting as if alive. I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, yet no one was there when I turned. Suddenly, a chilling gust swept through the hall, slamming doors and extinguishing the lights. Panic surged, but I clenched the locket tightly, focusing on its faint glow. A low, guttural growl reverberated from the basement, an ancient sound that vibrated deep in my bones. Against every instinct to flee, I descended the stairs, each step echoing like a drumbeat of doom. The basement was suffused with darkness, deeper and thicker than the blackest night. The locket's light barely penetrated the gloom, revealing old cracked bricks and discarded remnants of forgotten lives. Suddenly, from the shadows emerged a figure, tall, gaunt, and impossibly old. Its eyes burned with a malevolent fire, and its mouth twisted into a cruel smile. "You cannot stop what is coming," it hissed, voice like dry leaves scraping across a stone. "The city belongs to us, the forgotten, the damned. We will rise." I barely had time to react as it lunged, a blur of shadow and rage. I raised the locket in defense, its light flaring brilliantly, pushing back the creature. The basement trembled as if the very foundation of the house was cracking. The figure screamed, its form unraveling into tendrils of smoke that vanished into cracks in the walls. Shaken but determined, I retreated upstairs, locking the basement door behind me. The battle was escalating, and the entity was growing more desperate and violent. I knew I couldn't face it alone anymore. I called Lena, and we agreed to bring in a local historian and a spiritual medium who specialized in restless spirits and cursed places. Their knowledge might be the key to understanding and combating the darkness. Over the next few days, the house became a war zone of investigation. The historian uncovered disturbing records of mass disappearances, secret burials, and dark rituals that had taken place long before the city was founded. The medium sensed the heavy presence of spirits trapped in anguish, some tethered by anger, others by betrayal. We conducted seances in the darkest hours of the night, the medium channeling voices from beyond. The spirits spoke in riddles, their stories fragmented but filled with pain and rage. They told of betrayal by those they trusted, murders covered up by greed, and promises broken that sealed their fate. Every piece of the puzzle painted a portrait of a city built on lies and blood. Meanwhile, the entity's attacks intensified. Objects flew across rooms, chilling whispers echoed through empty halls, and shadows twisted into grotesque shapes. Sleep became a distant memory, replaced by nightmares where I was trapped beneath the earth, surrounded by endless rows of graves, the dead reaching for me with hollow eyes. Yet amidst the terror, I felt a growing resolve. I wasn't just fighting for my house, I was fighting for the city, for the souls trapped beneath, and for the future that could still be saved. The locket, once a symbol of innocent suffering, had become a beacon of hope and defiance. As the full moon rose high, casting pale light over the city, we prepared for what was to come. The entity would not give up, and neither would we. This was only the beginning of a war that would test every ounce of courage and faith we had left. The city was watching, holding its breath, as the battle between light and darkness unfolded beneath its very streets. The night of the full moon stretched long and heavy over the city, as if the very air had thickened with unseen tension. I stood at the edge of my front porch, the faint glow of the locket pulsing against my chest like a heartbeat trying to outpace the darkness around me. Lena, the historian, and the medium had arrived hours earlier, filling the house with a strange energy, a mix of fear, hope, and ancient knowledge. Inside, the medium was preparing her ritual space in the living room, drawing circles of salt and chalk, lighting candles infused with herbs said to repel evil. The historian laid out maps and documents on the kitchen table, tracing lines that marked the boundaries of the mass grave and the dark history intertwined with it. Despite all the research and preparation, I could feel the oppressive weight growing heavier, as if the house itself were a living thing, breathing in anticipation of the confrontation to come. We had agreed that tonight would be our last stand against the entity, the darkness that had haunted not only my home, but the entire city's underbelly. The medium's voice was steady but low as she explained the ritual, a binding ceremony designed to trap the spirit and sever its connection to the living world. It was dangerous, potentially draining all our energy, but it was the only way. As the clock neared midnight, we gathered in the living room, forming a circle around the glowing locket that lay at the center. The medium began chanting in a language I didn't understand, her voice rising and falling like the tide, summoning forces both benevolent and ancient. The candles flickered violently, casting dancing shadows that seemed to take shape. Faces, hands, twisting figures reaching out from the darkness. The temperature dropped sharply, and a cold wind swept through the room despite closed windows and doors. Then the house trembled, a low groan vibrating through the walls as if it were crying out in agony. From the basement came a sound, a terrible, guttural roar that shook the foundation beneath our feet. The entity had sensed our challenge and was coming to fight back. Suddenly, the lights went out completely, plunging us into pitch black. Panic surged for a moment, but the medium's voice grew louder, stronger, weaving a shield of sound and power around us. Then from the depths of the darkness, a figure emerged, an apparition of twisted shadows and rage. Its eyes glowed like embers, burning with hatred and desperation. It lunged at the circle, trying to break the protective barrier with a scream that echoed like thunder. We held firm, the light from the locket flaring bright, pushing back the entity's dark tendrils. The medium's chants intensified, calling on ancient spirits for aid. Suddenly, the room filled with a blinding light as ghostly figures appeared, silent witnesses to the tragedy that had unfolded beneath the city. They stood between us and the darkness, their faces filled with sorrow and resolve. The battle between light and shadow raged for what felt like hours, waves of terror crashing against our defenses. My body trembled with exhaustion and fear, but I held the locket tightly, its warmth a lifeline. At one point, the entity managed to touch me, its cold fingers slipping through my skin like ice, filling me with visions of death and despair. But the locket pulsed brighter, burning away the darkness, and I forced myself to fight back. Finally, with a scream that shook the very heavens, the entity began to unravel, its form dissolving into wisps of smoke and echoes. The spirits of the dead raised their voices in a mournful song, lifting the darkness from the house and surrounding streets. The oppressive weight lifted, replaced by a fragile calm. We collapsed, exhausted but victorious, for now. But as dawn broke over the city, casting soft light on broken windows and scarred walls, I knew this was not the end. The mass grave still lay beneath us, a wound in the earth that would not heal easily. The city's secrets were deeper and darker than we had imagined, and the spirits still cried out for justice. I looked at Lena, the historian, and the medium, seeing the same mix of fear and determination in their eyes. We had won a battle, but the war was far from over. My house was no longer just a place to live. It was a battleground between the living and the dead, the forgotten and the remembered. And I was caught in the middle, the unwilling guardian of a terrible truth. As I stepped outside, the morning sun struggled to break through thick clouds, casting long shadows over the city streets. I felt the eyes of the unseen watching, waiting for the next move. The locket around my neck felt heavy once more, not with fear, but with responsibility. I knew I had to uncover the full story behind the mass grave, to bring peace to the restless souls trapped beneath. But to do that, I would have to delve deeper into the city's darkest history, face enemies both human and supernatural, and confront truths that might shatter everything I believed. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with dangers lurking in every shadow. But I was ready. Whatever came next, I would not run. I would fight. For my home, for the city, and for the souls whose stories had been buried for too long. The sun rose higher, but the shadows remained. And in the silence I heard a whisper, soft but clear, a promise that the darkness was far from defeated. The story was only just beginning. Days bled into restless nights as I found myself trapped in an endless loop of searching and fearing. The city, once a place I had seen only as a backdrop to my life, now felt like a maze of shadows and secrets twisting beneath every street lamp. The mass grave beneath my house was more than a forgotten tragedy. It was a festering wound feeding into something far more sinister. After the ritual, despite the temporary reprieve, I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes followed me in every crowd, that whispers clung to the wind when I walked alone. Lena and the medium were relentless. The historian delved deeper into archives that seemed to reject her presence, uncovering names and dates that only raised more questions, while the medium sensed that the spirit we had fought was but a fragment of a larger, more ancient darkness tethered to the land itself. One afternoon, while sifting through yellowed newspapers in the city library basement, a place heavy with dust and history, I stumbled on a reference to an old asylum that once stood mere blocks from my home. It was torn down decades ago, but records hinted at hard experiments and mysterious disappearances linked to that site. The mass grave might not just be from a war or epidemic as we'd first thought, but a dumping ground for victims of cruelty disguised as care. The thought chilled me to the bone. At night, the house seemed to pulse with a new energy, heavier and more malevolent. The shadows lengthened and stretched across the walls like fingers reaching for me, and the whispers grew louder, more urgent. Sleep became a stranger. I would wake gasping, drenched in sweat, visions of anguished faces pressing against the walls of my mind. One night, as a thunderstorm raged outside, the lights flickered violently, plunging the house into strobing darkness. The temperature plummeted, and a chilling silence fell, a silence so deep it roared in my ears. Suddenly, a heavy knock echoed through the hallway. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the medium and Lena were both away, caught up in their own research. Heart hammering, I opened the door to the empty street, the rain washing away all footprints and signs of whoever had knocked. But as I turned back inside, I noticed a small dirt-encrusted box on the doorstep. Inside was a faded journal, its cover cracked and brittle with age. The first page bore the name Dr. Elias Morrow in shaky handwriting, the same name Lena had uncovered linked to the asylum's darkest experiments. The journal detailed horrific experiments on patients, cruel attempts to unlock the mind's hidden powers, and a final, desperate entry about silencing the restless souls before they escape. The words stabbed at me with cold urgency. It was clear now. The mass grave was a consequence of those experiments gone wrong. That night, the house seemed alive with anger. The walls whispered threats, and unseen hands grazed my skin like icy blades. I realized the entity we'd confronted was just a vanguard, a sentinel guarding a deeper evil buried beneath. Desperate for answers, I contacted an old friend from college, a professor specializing in paranormal phenomena. His voice trembled over the phone when I told him what I'd found. He warned me about the danger of awakening such darkness, urging caution but promising to help however he could. Meanwhile, Lena discovered a hidden chamber beneath the ruins of the asylum, filled with medical equipment stained with rust and remnants of ritualistic symbols etched into the stone floor. It was a place of horrors where science had blurred into occult, and suffering had been an experiment. The connections were undeniable. The mass grave, my house, the restless spirits. It was all part of a dark chapter the city had tried to bury. One evening, as I pored over the journal's pages, the lights flickered again, and the locket glowed fiercely, burning against my skin. Suddenly, a cold breath whispered in my ear, "You should have stayed buried." Panic surged as the temperature dropped sharply. Shadows gathered, coalescing into forms too twisted and ghastly to describe. They pressed in on me, their voices a chorus of pain and fury. I clutched the locket tighter, repeating the medium's chants from memory, trying to hold the darkness at bay. For hours I fought alone, my voice cracking but determined. When dawn finally broke, the apparitions faded, but I knew they would return, stronger and more vengeful. The battle was far from over. Exhausted and trembling, I understood now that the mass grave wasn't just a site of death. It was a prison, a wound that if left unattended would unravel the very fabric of the city's soul. The spirits were calling out for justice, for the truth to be unearthed and acknowledged. I was their unwilling advocate, the thin line between peace and chaos. As the city stirred awake, oblivious to the horrors lurking beneath, I prepared myself. I had to confront the past head-on, uncover the full extent of Dr. Morrow's atrocities, confront the restless spirits, and face the darkness that had claimed my home as its domain. The fight would be long and perilous, but I was no longer alone. With Lena, the medium, and my old professor by my side, we would uncover every secret buried in the city's shadows, no matter the cost. The house groaned around me, its walls echoing the cries of the forgotten. The locket's warmth was a small comfort against the gathering storm. This was no longer just my story. It was a reckoning for the city itself, and I was ready to face whatever horrors awaited in the darkness. The days that followed felt like a descent into madness. The veil between reality and nightmare had thinned so much that I wasn't sure where one ended and the other began. Our small group, me, Lena, the medium, and my professor, pushed forward, digging into the horrors hidden beneath the city's surface. The journal of Dr. Elias Morrow guided us, but it was only a skeleton of the dark truth. Every revelation seemed to open more questions, more hidden doors into a twisted history no one wanted to face. Lena's findings about the asylum's chamber had been the key that unlocked a floodgate of terror. We ventured there one night, flashlight beams cutting through the thick darkness beneath the ruined building. The air was stale and heavy, soaked with the metallic scent of rust and decay. As we stepped deeper into the cold stone corridors, the silence was broken only by the distant drip of water echoing through the tunnels. The medium's hands trembled as she traced the faded symbols on the floor, her voice barely audible as she chanted incantations meant to protect and bind. But the house's darkness was here, too, trailing us like a shadow, unseen but palpable. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing scream shattered the silence. It was not human, not entirely. The sound clawed at our sanity, and a freezing chill gripped the room. We froze, hearts pounding, as the walls seemed to breathe, closing in around us. The shadows shifted, morphing into twisted figures, writhing in agony. I could see faces, tormented, desperate, pleading. Some tried to speak, their voices a fractured chorus of warning and pain. Others cursed with hatred that burned like acid. The medium stepped forward, her eyes wide but resolute, and began a desperate ritual, her voice steady despite the terror. Lena and my professor held back, shielding themselves with protective charms, while I clutched the locket that had become my lifeline. The ritual was a battle of wills, a struggle against a force that sought to drag us into the abyss of despair and oblivion. Hours passed in a blur of chants and screams, shadows and light. When it finally ended, the chamber fell silent once more, but the weight of what we had witnessed pressed on us like a leaden shroud. Outside, the city pulsed with life, oblivious to the darkness we had faced, the secrets we now carried. Days later, back at the house, the hauntings escalated. Objects moved on their own, chilling drafts whispered through locked rooms, and the locket glowed with an eerie light that seemed to pulse in time with my racing heartbeat. Sleep was a distant memory. I spent nights researching, piecing together old court records, newspaper articles, and testimonies from families who had lost loved ones to the asylum. Their stories were shattered fragments of a collective nightmare. People who had vanished without explanation, experiments that blurred the lines between science and horror, and a cover-up that spanned decades. One name appeared repeatedly: Dr. Morrow, the man who had led the asylum's darkest chapter, his thirst for knowledge and power eclipsing any sense of humanity. The journal hinted at a final experiment, one that was supposed to unlock the secrets of the human soul, but instead unleashed something far more terrible. As I delved deeper, the house seemed to respond. The walls whispered secrets in languages I could not understand. At times, the voices were almost comforting, as if the spirits sought my help, but just as often they turned malicious, their anger boiling beneath the surface. The medium warned that the boundary between our world and theirs was thinning dangerously. We were not just uncovering history, we were reopening wounds that had never healed. One night, a violent storm trapped us inside. Lightning illuminated the sky in jagged bursts, and thunder shook the house to its foundations. In the flickering light, the shadows gathered in the corners, writhing and shifting like living smoke. I felt a presence behind me, cold, heavy, suffocating. Turning slowly, I saw a figure emerging from the darkness, a man with hollow eyes and a twisted smile that promised only pain. It was Dr. Morrow or something wearing his face. His voice was a rasping whisper, a venomous hiss that filled the room with dread. He spoke of unfinished business, of souls that refused to rest, of secrets that must remain buried. I stood frozen, the locket burning against my chest, fighting to hold on to reality. The professor and Lena joined me, their faces pale but determined. Together we confronted the apparition, demanding answers, demanding peace for the tortured souls beneath us. The confrontation was brutal. The house shook, the shadows screamed, and the air crackled with unseen energy. But as dawn broke, the figure faded, leaving behind a chilling promise. The darkness was not done with us. Exhausted, broken, but unbowed, we understood the magnitude of what lay ahead. This was no longer a battle to save a single house or soul. It was a war for the city's very soul, for the memories buried beneath its streets, and for the redemption of those lost to time and cruelty. We prepared for what would come next, knowing the night would return, bringing with it horrors we had yet to imagine. And as the first light of day touched the battered walls of my house, I swore I would not let the darkness win. The air in the house grew heavier with each passing day, the silence before the storm becoming a deafening roar inside my mind. The lingering shadows, once distant whispers, now pressed close like suffocating walls, twisting every corner of my reality. We had come too far to turn back, though none of us were sure we'd make it out sane or alive. Lena and the professor worked tirelessly, trying to decipher the final pieces of Dr. Morrow's journal, searching for a way to end the nightmare once and for all. The medium, though visibly drained, refused to give in to despair, her rituals growing more potent, but also more dangerous. Every night brought new terrors, phantom footsteps pounding through empty halls, disembodied voices that cried out for justice, and cold hands that seemed to claw at the very fabric of my soul. One evening, as the sun sank beneath the horizon and the city lights flickered like distant stars, we gathered in the heart of the house, the very spot where the mass grave lay beneath the foundations. The medium prepared the space, inscribing ancient symbols with trembling hands while Lena and the professor read aloud from the journal's final cryptic passage. I stood in the center, clutching the locket that had become my anchor, my shield against the growing darkness. The air thickened, crackling with unseen energy as the ritual began. A low chant filled the room, ancient words vibrating with power that stirred the shadows into a frenzy. The ground beneath us trembled, dust falling from the ceiling like silent tears. Then, without warning, the walls erupted with screams, the voices of the tortured souls trapped beneath the city for generations. Faces appeared in the shadows, men, women, children, their eyes wide with anguish, their mouths twisted in silent cries. But in the center of the chaos, a single figure emerged. Dr. Morrow, more terrifying than ever, his eyes glowing with madness and rage. He spoke with a voice that shook the foundation of the earth, declaring that the truth would never be silenced, that his work would live on through suffering and despair. We stood firm, our voices rising to drown out his fury. The medium's chants grew louder, weaving a protective barrier around us. Lena held the journal high, reciting the final incantation written by Morrow's own hand, the key to unlocking the curse. The house shook violently as the dark figure writhed, screaming in rage and agony. Slowly, the faces in the shadows began to soften, their pain giving way to peace. One by one, the tortured souls faded into the light, released at last from their eternal torment. Dr. Morrow's form shattered like glass, his final scream echoing into silence. The oppressive weight lifted, replaced by an almost unbearable stillness. The air cleared, the cold retreated, and for the first time in months, I felt the warmth of the sun on my skin through the broken window. Exhausted but relieved, we emerged from the house, the city greeting us with the indifferent hum of everyday life. The mass grave remained buried beneath the foundations, but its curse had been broken. The house stood silent, no longer a prison for restless spirits, but a testament to the resilience of those who dared to face the darkness. Life slowly returned to normal, or at least what passed for normal after such horrors. I often walk past the house now, its windows dark but peaceful. Sometimes I think I hear faint whispers carried on the wind, reminders of a past never to be forgotten. I keep the locket close, a symbol of the battle fought and won, a reminder that some shadows must be faced to find the light. The city moves on, oblivious to the horrors beneath its streets, but I carry the memory of those lost souls, and the knowledge that sometimes the darkest places hide the brightest truths. My house was built over a mass grave, yes, but it was also where I learned that courage, hope, and the will to fight can pierce even the deepest darkness. The nightmare is over, but its lessons remain, etched into the bones of the city and the hearts of those who survive. And so the story ends here, in the quiet aftermath of terror, with the dawn breaking over a house no longer haunted, but finally free.